Well, first, let me thank you for giving me the Lifetime Achievement Award for ISJR. Over the years, I've looked forward to coming to the meetings of ISJR, wherever they've been, all over the world, to talk to my colleagues about ideas of justice. And because I know most of you and I've seen you speak and heard about your work over the years, I'm especially appreciative that you are giving this award. And of course, receiving this award has caused me to think a little bit about my own views about what aspect of justice research is important and what we should all be doing in the future. And that's what I would like to talk to you about today. A key characteristic of human beings is their capacity to develop complex social forms that encourage and enable cooperation. Justice is what makes this possible by facilitating three socially beneficial tasks: making allocations and resolving conflicts among individuals, legitimating authorities, and helping institutions to function. It's the ability of people to actively develop and utilize justice-based rules, as well as systems of authority that operate based upon these principles of justice, that allows collectivities, whether they're dyads, small groups, organizations, institutions, communities, or even entire societies, to create and maintain the conditions that enable people to work together cooperatively. The challenge of cooperation is that people live their lives within social contexts, and these social contexts vary in many ways, but they all pose a similar challenge. That challenge is to manage interactions that require the modification of people's own behavior based upon the desire of others. Such modifications are inherently problematic when a core human motivation for interacting with others is the pursuit of personal self-interest, that is, the satisfaction of personal desires. To be able to participate in social settings, people have to be both willing and able to modify their actions to take account of the interests of others. In other words, they simply can't do what they want. First, people have to be motivated to adjust their behavior to respond to the concerns of others. They have to be interested in cooperating. It is obvious to most people that they're better off living in a social group, even if they have to modify their behavior to some degree, than they would be if they lived alone. Social groups allow for the specialization of tasks and make it possible to engage in joint efforts that are beyond the capacity of any single person, as anyone who's ever needed a lawyer, doctor, or accountant quickly realizes. They expand the resources that are available, leading to the possibility that everybody becomes better off in a group setting. Today, most of us cannot imagine a life outside of these dense social frameworks, nor would we want to live without the benefits of cooperation, despite any potential romantic allure of the novel Robinson Crusoe and the thought of living alone. Sometimes, although frustrated and denied, people are concerned, but they recognize that they're better off working with others, as is evidenced by the course of social evolution over time into ever denser social groupings. However, to successfully engage in relationships with others, people also must be able to effectively manage the exchanges involved. They must have the social intelligence needed to know how to cooperate. This is the case because although they may benefit in general from cooperation in the context of any particular interaction, people still need to be able to determine what is an acceptable outcome vis-a-vis others in that situation, so that they do not end up being exploited in relationships or by groups. This requires more than the simple desire to cooperate. It also involves being able to agree with others about how to cooperate. And people need to be able to determine how desirable particular relationships are, so they can adjust the degree of their involvement in any particular relationship. As anyone who's ever dated knows, although being in a relationship is potentially desirable, couples still need to determine how to divide the housework and cooking duties. And people are often alert to the possibility that there are other relationships around that might be better. So leaving and starting anew is always a possibility. Of course, it is never guaranteed that people dealing with others can effectively create and maintain the conditions for cooperation. And the history of human societies is one of continual struggle to maintain productive relationships with others. The complexities of cooperation are illustrated by the large psychological literature on the prisoner's dilemma game. This game involves a situation in which two parties both stand to gain by cooperating with one another, but cooperation involves a risk. If one person cooperates and the other defects, the cooperator loses a considerable amount and the defector gains. This task has been widely studied by psychologists because it illustrates the core issue in cooperation. It is beneficial if successfully achieved, but involves risks for the people who put their own welfare under the control of other people's decisions. Studies of negotiation suggest that people are not especially good at managing cooperation problems. Research on college students indicates that they are frequently unable to play the prisoner's dilemma game with others and often end up unable to find an effective strategy of mutual cooperation. The core point is that people may be motivated to achieve a solution that benefits them, but they still need a strategy that enables them to end up successfully cooperating with others. The bottom line of this literature is that people are better off if they're more skilled at creating and maintaining cooperative relationships. The way to do this is to develop approaches which facilitate effective cooperation in the context of ongoing interactions. And my key point is that justice is one such mechanism. Justice first facilitates resolving conflicts over allocations or rule interpretations by providing a set of rules that the immediate parties to a dispute will accept because they perceive them to be fair. The core justice argument is that having a set of such rules facilitates the resolution of disagreements as long as the parties agree on the principles of justice that ought to apply in a given setting. In other words, justice provides a framework through which people can step back from the pursuit of self-interest without feeling like a sucker or a fool. Hence, while people are motivated to cooperate, they are more likely to do so successfully in the context of a particular situation when they can agree on a reasonable cooperation strategy. Justice defines such a reasonable strategy. It tells people, for example, that an equal division of resources is appropriate. Justice rules communicate what is appropriate and fair. Such rules are beneficial to all because they create a framework within which productive and profitable social interactions can occur. People can focus on whether or not they are getting what they deserve, and there are clear rules to indicate what that means. Consequently, they are more willing to make and adhere to agreements with others that follow these principles. Combined with the motivation to cooperate, justice-based rules create the conditions under which people can and do cooperate. How do we know that justice is something that people seek because it enables the effective management of conflict? Studies suggest that people focus more heavily upon justice rules when they believe that a profitable relationship is threatened by disruption. In situations of potential instability, for example, task relationships with unequal power, questions of fairness become a more important issue to the participants. The role of justice in facilitating the management of conflicts can be illustrated by examining the literature on distributive justice. Theories of distributive justice argue that people compare their outcomes to standards of what is deserved. In other words, people have a sense of what they are entitled to receive and evaluate their outcomes against this standard. Studies show that people express the greatest satisfaction when they receive a fair distribution in comparison to receiving more or less in absolute terms, but thinking that they are being given too much or too little in justice terms. These findings suggest the value of justice as a tool enabling cooperation. If people are willing to accept less than they want because their outcomes are fair, then having clear standards of fairness can facilitate cooperation. Does distributive justice work as intended? Does it facilitate cooperation? If it does, then relationships characterized by distributive fairness are more stable and long-lasting. And this is the finding of studies of long-term relationships. Those relationships in which the parties experience their interactions as consistent with distributive fairness have a better psychological quality and last longer. And I'm thinking here of the literature on interpersonal relations, on marriage. Therefore, justice norms are found to have the desired effect of facilitating satisfying and stable long-term social interactions. Procedural justice also facilitates cooperation. Studies show that agreements reached in mediation are more likely to be adhered to over time if the mediation procedures were fair, as are the agreements reached in fair child custody hearings. Finally, research indicates that people value justice enough that they will incur material losses to pressure others to distribute resources via principles of justice. And they do so even when they will not receive these resources. For example, research shows that if people are given the opportunity to choose a setting in which they could enforce cooperation rules at a personal cost, they choose this setting. And when they're in it, they're willing to forego personal gains to punish those people who deviate from cooperative choices. In other words, people were willing to pay costs to enforce fairness rules by punishing those who violated those rules. Recent research on such altruistic punishment suggests that personally rewarding neural processes are activated when people engage in behavior designed to protect group rules, suggesting that people's motivation to protect group rules may develop within fundamental human cognitive and emotional processes. Despite its ability to facilitate agreements, distributive justice is hindered by the fact that people are motivated by both self-interest and justice, motivations that can come into conflict. One type of conflict is illustrated by Walster, using the example of people who receive too much. Unlike those who receive too little, who simply want outcomes to be redistributed, those who receive too much are in a conflict because they both want to redistribute outcomes to achieve justice and they want to keep the too much that they have. To keep their too much, advantage parties need to psychologically justify having too much. This justification leads the advantaged to develop a rationale for keeping their resources. But it creates conflict with those who have received too little and hence undermines society. Three distinct harms occur. The disadvantaged party becomes angry and may retaliate against the advantaged party. The relationship is destroyed and no further productive interaction occurs among the parties, and the victim may become alienated and bitter. So society is better off if people do not act in self-serving ways and looks for ways to prevent that from occurring. This argument suggests that distributive justice principles work best when they can be applied unambiguously, so that self-serving motivations are less likely to be engaged in the first place. Studies of allocation illustrate this by showing that the influence of self-serving and justificatory motivations occurs least often when the situation is unambiguous. So creating clarity encourages actual fairness. For example, if people are allocating cookies, everybody recognizes that they should take the same number of cookies. However, if people are allocating mashed potatoes from a bowl, people take more than an equal share. Ambiguity promotes self-serving behavior. The argument that a lack of ambiguity promotes the role of justice in securing cooperation by damping down self-serving motivations suggests a reason that the use of equality as an allocation principle promotes social harmony and good feeling. Equality is desirable in that the principle of equal division is transparent and clear. The two other primary principles of distributive justice are equity and need, each of which requires a differentiation among people. Alone among these principles, equality does not involve any need to rank people. We know that people engage in self-serving biases when judging their ability or need, and that these biases make it difficult for the parties in an interaction to agree on divisions of resources when that division requires evaluation of the party's contribution or need. For example, when people are asked to estimate their contributions to joint projects, they're found to exaggerate, just as people generally exaggerate their intelligence and capability. As a consequence, it is difficult for interested parties to work out cooperative solutions in situations where there is ambiguity about the interpretation of justice standards. The problem of exaggerated perceptions of entitlement reflects the general tendency for people to define justice through the prism of self-interest. groups. It is the fact that all parties to an allocation or conflict share common justice values that makes justice effective as a tool facilitating cooperation. For justice to play the role outlined, there needs to be agreement about what the relevant principles of justice are. People's potential willingness to accept a just solution means very little if they cannot agree on what is fair. This is important for all three of the forms of justice: distributive, retributive, and procedural. The concept of justice is not something that the parties to a particular interaction generate on the spot. Consensus about these principles is something that has already been created by groups to facilitate their interactions. And when people step into an interaction, they bring their shared sense of justice with them. Deutsch, for example, presented three core principles of distributive justice: equity, equality, and need. Evidence from studies conducted in the United States suggests that within a given allocation setting, for example, work, community, family, there is a general social consensus about what distributive justice principles ought to govern allocations. For example, in the United States, people generally agree that work settings should be governed by equity, social settings by equality, and social welfare settings by need. It is not necessary that people within all societies agree about principles of justice. Just as everyone in the world need not speak the same language, the only issue is whether people who interact with each other have a shared social framework within which to coordinate their actions. Hence, cross-cultural studies show that different societies have different rules of distributive or retributive fairness within particular arenas, but that within those societies, people also tend to agree about a common rule. The need for consensus is potentially threatening to the viability of pluralistic societies, which are composed of people of varying ethnicity, religion, and other differences. The range of diversity that a group can contain and still create shared mechanisms for cooperation is not well understood. Rawls, for example, expressed skepticism about the ability of societies to survive without shared justice values. How do societies manage when the people within them do not share a consensus about justice, whether distributive or retributive? How do people from different societies cooperate across group boundaries when their societies differ in their justice models? Research suggests that people agree more strongly about the principles defining fair procedures than fair outcomes or fair punishments, providing a reason that authorities and institutions focus on the use of fair procedures to resolve divisive problems. The centrality of procedures for resolving distributive or retributive problems will be discussed in the next section. The issue of consensus involves the more general question of how groups socialize their members. Do justice rules emerge from people's social experience? Such shared principles could reflect similar experiences within a particular society because all of its members face similar issues that they have to solve. Justice rules could also reflect socialization into cultural values via family or school. Overall, I think we need to focus more strongly on the group level when we think about justice rules, asking how they come to be a shared property of groups. In addition to facilitating resource allocation and the resolution of conflicts among individuals, justice provides a second benefit. It plays a role in the legitimation of the action taken by authority. I suggest that the ability of groups to enhance cooperation by creating, empowering, and deferring to authorities depends upon the ability of those authorities to enact justice. Such authorities can be people who hold formal positions of responsibility in a group, such as a judge or police officer, but they can also be trusted individuals, an elder in the family, an uncle, a teacher, or a religious leader. Each of these is someone who is not directly involved in the dispute or allocation, but is given a role in resolving it. Thibault and Walker showed that people involved in social interactions with others sometimes recognize that they cannot resolve conflicts among themselves. At that point, people support empowering authorities. And this is a good idea because authorities are better able to resolve conflicts due to two desirable attributes: neutrality and any expertise they have due to specialized training or experiences from working with other conflicts. Because authorities are more neutral and disinterested, they can more effectively overcome the problems of self-interested motivation that make it difficult for the parties involved in a dispute to implement distributive justice rules and create acceptable agreements. They are also less emotionally involved and can make better decisions about suitable punishments for rule breaking. A neutral authority can establish a fair outcome, and having a clear standard of right and wrong articulated by an authority encourages the parties to redistribute resources rather than engaging in psychological justification. Hence, having a third-party authority facilitates a socially superior form of resolution, one less likely to create bad feeling and undermine long-term relationships. Just as people are less likely to act based upon self-serving motivations when the resources being allocated are clearly partitioned, people are less likely to act upon self-serving motivations when a legitimate authority is clearly telling them what a fair distribution is. Why is it better for the parties not to act upon self-serving motivations? While justification may be psychologically satisfying to one party, it undermines social relationships because it leaves an aggrieved victim. Society favors restitution, so the ability of authorities to encourage it is a desirable attribute. Authorities are also able to apply expertise to the use of justice rules, crafting potentially better solutions. The negotiation literature has made the idea of an integrative agreement very popular, and mediators are able to help the parties to achieve these superior agreements in which the total utility contained in the agreement is higher. Similarly, authorities can craft distributive justice rules that are more complex and effective. Studies of distributive justice suggest that authorities do in fact use their position to enact more complex distributive models than are reflected in simple equality. They create rules of distribution that combine equality with equity and need, seeking to maintain social harmony while also promoting productivity and individual welfare. For example, many work organizations divide up annual compensation increases into two parts, giving everyone giving people some set amount of a raise, that's equality, and then allocating some money to those who work harder or produce more as equity. So in other words, they're balancing equality and equity. This addresses the goals of social harmony and productivity at the same time. In general, while people create rules to maintain relationships, no single rule can cover all situations. There are conflicts among rules. A worker with a sick child invokes the principle of need to justify leaving their job, whereas the manager invokes equity to argue that the lost productivity should be held against them. No single rule is sufficiently complex to handle the problems and issues arising in social interactions. A better approach is the creation of authorities with the ability to do what is right within the situation. Authorities have the advantage of being able to exercise discretion. That is, they can adapt to unique or changing situations by deciding to apply different justice rules. Hence, it is not surprising that one commonly chosen approach that groups adopt to determine fair approaches to allocation is to choose an authority and let them make decisions. As noted, this provides a mechanism through which equity, need, and other similar principles can operate in complex situations. Consider the recent example of the efforts of Kenneth Feinberg to allocate resources to the families of the victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, or the people living in the Gulf whose lives were damaged by the BP oil spill, or the bankers whose compensation was shaped by their acceptance of TARP funding. In each case, an expert developed a complex application of distributive justice rules. While authorities are valuable as disinterested and knowledgeable allocators and can help to resolve the problems that occur when interested parties try to implement rules of fairness in the face of self-serving biases, the introduction of authorities raises other issues of social coordination. One is whether and when people defer to authorities and view their decisions as legitimate, right, and proper. Having empowered authorities, people have to decide how to view their decisions, when to see them as legitimate and when to accept them. The flip side of discretion is the possibility of mistrust. Just as equality is a straightforward rule and hence builds social harmony, discretion-based differentiations carry the risk of undermining trust and confidence in authorities when people suspect the motives that lead to differences in allocation. Authorities, in other words, have to justify their use of principles that differentiate among allocations to people based upon equity and need. When retribution is involved, it is important to explain varying sentences based upon circumstances of the crime or criminal. If our concern is with the legitimacy of authority and the ability to gain acceptance for more complex decisions, the justice focus moves to procedural justice. Studies suggest that people give legitimacy to authorities when they believe that they are exercising their authority fairly. This provides an important suggestion about how authorities gain acceptance. They provide evidence that they are using fair procedures. It is their legitimacy that gains authorities' deference. Their legitimacy is linked to procedural justice, and procedural justice is based upon both fair decision-making and fair interpersonal treatment. It is the latter aspect of procedural justice, quality of treatment, that is relational in nature, and that is especially important from the point of view of facilitating cooperation. Fairness in the form of fair decision-making leads to higher quality decisions, and for this reason may facilitate decision acceptance. That is linked to the expertise of authorities. If, for example, authorities can create an integrative agreement, the parties are more willing to accept it. They can also draw upon facts to craft suitable decisions. Getting to Yes, a widely cited guide on how to negotiate effectively, advocates using neutral fact-based standards when negotiating, for example, to establish the fair price of a car by citing a table of used car prices. The other key to success, however, is relational. People are willing to defer to the solutions authorities propose in part because the authority acts in ways that validate the parties by showing respect for their status and standing in the group, displaying concern for their views, and expressing a desire to do what is right for the people they're dealing with. Relational elements are distinct from the nature and quality of the decision itself and are a separate aspect of procedural justice related to the party's social link with the authority. This relational element is especially important from the perspectives of society because it reliably facilitates the acceptance of the authority's decisions and thereby facilitates cooperation. When a person cannot receive the outcome they want concerning some conflict with others, they can still feel validated by the authority in relational terms, and this relational basis for exercising authority is therefore a mechanism through which neutral parties can enhance the level of cooperation when dealing with disputants. When people have a social link with the authority or the group, justice and not self-interest becomes the key issue they consider when deciding whether or not to accept their decisions. In contrast, when people lack such a relationship, they focus on what they might gain or lose from accepting a third-party decision. The stronger social links between a party and an authority therefore lead the party's behavior to be shaped by relational as opposed to instrumental issues. These arguments concerning the advantage of having authorities make justice decisions are also reflected in the case of retributive justice. When people feel that others have broken rules and gained unfair advantage, they're motivated to take personal action against them. Such private actions are often engaged in emotionally, without a search for truth, leaving innocent people to be harmed. Further, they're frequently disproportionate to the magnitude of the original harm, and there is no consistency in the reactions to similar wrongs from person to person or over time. These reactions can also intensify into spirals of violence that spread across families, clans, and communities. Further, they're determined by power rather than rightness, and hence reflect force more than any process that people in society would widely view as legitimate. Trial by combat has the advantage of settling disputes, but it's difficult to see it as the basis for legitimacy, and it fits best with a low level of social evolution in which leaders rule through the possession and use of power. When problems are resolved in this way, there is no effective basis for reincorporating the victim and the offender into future joint exchanges, and a legacy of anger remains. In other words, collectivities gain when people give the power to right wrongs to authorities, rather than undertaking the task of retribution themselves, because these disinterested authorities can contain the scope of retribution and make the magnitude of punishment more consistent and appropriate to community standards. They can introduce shared visions of justice in reactions to wrongdoing. They also have expertise and experience with other cases, so they can be more consistent and more sensitive to situational issues. To be able to be effective, however, authorities require that the people who are victims and their immediate social group cede the use of force to central authorities. The argument that legal authorities can manage retribution assumes that they represent the community and act in ways that reflect commonly shared values. When the formal rules used by authorities diverge from people's everyday understanding of justice, people go outside the law and engage in vigilantism and extra-legal actions. While common conceptions about a justice are important, retributive justice also illustrates a second value of having a disinterested authority responsible for making decisions about punishment. Such an authority can exercise discretion and interpret rules in light of the particular circumstances of the situation. Abstract rules of justice are typically not enough to define appropriate punishment in any particular case. An interpretation of the situation is required to establish moral accountability. As with distributive justice, the decision makers have more information and potentially more expertise, and their decisions reflect greater complexity. This means that inevitably their decisions will diverge from popular will, and the authorities will have to justify their actions, which they can best do by reference to the fairness of their procedures. Again, relational mechanisms become important, especially when dealing with people who have social links with the authorities and therefore care about relational issues. To summarize, a second way in which justice is valuable is that it provides a basis for authorities to gain acceptance for their decisions. Authorities are neutral and have expertise. They can use these characteristics to craft more complex justice-based solutions. But will these solutions be accepted? The authorities have to balance their ability to make more complex applications of justice rules using their discretionary authority against being able to get acceptance for their decisions both among the parties involved and with people more generally. As was the case in the previous discussion, the key is not the views of one party. There needs to be a basis for everyone involved to understand the justice of what the third party does and have a basis for accepting it. There needs to be a consensus among the parties that the actions of the authority are reasonable and just. In discussions of allocation, we typically talk about winners and losers, and are especially concerned that the loser has some basis for accepting the decision. Otherwise, the basis for a future relationship among the parties is undermined, and there may be continued hostility and undermining of the resolution of the current dispute. In the case of punishment, it is equally important that all parties, victim, offender, and observers, feel that justice is done. The victim is particularly important, but if the offender does not feel fairly treated, their respect for the law is undermined, leading to a greater likelihood of recidivism and general law breaking in the future. In contrast, if all the parties find the punishment fair, there is the basis for a degree of reconciliation and cooperation in the future. As an example, research on restorative justice conferences shows that when the victim can participate in deciding what to do in response to wrongdoing, and the offender apologizes, victims often become the strongest advocates of non-punitive measures such as community service, and take an active and ongoing interest in efforts to help the offender become a law-abiding and productive member of the group. This balance highlights a second important issue for justice research. How do authorities use justice to legitimate more complex decisions among all of the parties to an interaction? Decisions that depart from common sense justice, even if they're more complex and reflect expertise and experience, are initially likely to be viewed as unfair by the parties. Studies suggest that the parties defer when they perceive that the authority is acting with the intention of achieving justice. In other words, they focus on the intention. In other words, trust in the motives and sincerity of the authority is key. How do you communicate trustworthiness and create trust? Two ways are by explaining what the procedures you are using are and explaining why you are making the decisions you do, as well as by acknowledging people's needs and concerns in these explanations. To do so, it is first important to let people present their concerns and evidence that they feel is relevant so that these can be used both in making a decision and in justifying it. Hence, the study of justice in the context of authorities needs to consider how authorities create trust. Walster makes the argument that judges can facilitate decision acceptance by making clear pronouncements about justice, and the authorities can craft superior decisions that the parties ought to accept. The key issue is how such decisions can be made legitimate to all the parties to a conflict so that they will accept them. This question is one that is going to be crucial for the future because we're entering into an era of intensifying conflict over ever scarcer resources with a population that is increasingly skeptical of the trustworthiness of authorities. Thibault and Walker argue that the use of fair procedures enable authorities, and a large literature supports that view. But it also is clear that authorities face challenges in using fair procedures. Chief among those challenges is that acting neutrally and being responsive are seldom in sync. So gaining deference through relational mechanism, such as those linked to quality of treatment, consideration of people's needs, evidence of caring, potentially undermines consistent rule following and over time undermines the perception of fair decision making. When people are personally involved in a decision, they put great weight on their quality of treatment, while when they are evaluating institutions and authorities, they focus on neutrality. By responding to the party's needs, an authority can therefore communicate to the larger group that they are not neutral. Balance is needed. Well, so to summarize, my second point is that people have the sophistication to create and empower authorities. This increases the scope of cooperation because authorities can apply justice rules in situations in which the parties have trouble being effective in resolving conflicts among themselves. The effectiveness of these authorities also depends on their ability to craft solutions that are viewed as just and thereby legitimate their decisions to all the parties in an allocation or as a response to rule breaking. The third reason that justice is important is that it facilitates social organization of a more sophisticated type, which is based upon the creation of organized collectivities, organizations, institutions, communities, and societies, which can motivate the willing and active involvement of people within themselves. People do not care about justice only when they have a particular allocation to make or dispute to resolve. Their evaluations of the justice of the everyday rules and policies of institutions, whether the company they work for, the government they have, or the community they live in, shape their willingness to engage themselves with others and to act on behalf of the entities beyond themselves in which they're living or working. Even more sophisticated forms of cooperation can occur if people involve themselves in interactions in the context of organized groups and change the basis of their interaction with others from self-interest to identification with those groups. People are more willing to do this when they evaluate those groups or institutions as creating and enforcing rules and policies fairly. Hence, justice is also important on an institutional or community level. This form of connection to others produces groups that are highly effective because their members are willingly acting upon the interests of their group rather than carefully calculating their commitment based upon their own gains and losses. Authorities do not necessarily need to have the consent of the parties to implement their interpretation of rules. They can enforce rules based upon the possession of power, and we see autocratic authorities do this every day. However, authorities are more effective if they can gain acceptance based upon people's internal values, such as legitimacy, morality, and justice. If people think it is appropriate or right to defer to an authority or an institution because of their legitimacy or because their decisions or rules are moral or just, then people take the responsibility to accept the decisions, to follow the rules upon themselves. Groups thrive when they're organized in this way, and procedural justice on the group level motivates identification, which then leads to the merger of self and group goals, the adoption of group values and purposes, and higher levels of voluntary cooperation with the group and its authorities and rules. The retributive justice literature also supports the argument that an important part of people's justice concerns involves maintaining societal institutions. Studies suggest that people's primary goal in reacting to wrongdoing is not about the immediate relationship, but about the maintenance of society and social rules. Rule breaking is viewed as a threat to social cohesion, and appropriate punishment restores the stature of group values. Evidence suggests that people are motivated to punish when they view wrongdoing as undercutting a group's moral and social values, and that they choose the type and severity of punishment in a manner that's designed to restore an appropriate moral balance. A consequence is that those people whose actions and demeanor show a defiance or disrespect for society, for social values, or for the social status of their victims are more likely to be punished and likely to be punished more severely. The recognition that punishment is central to maintaining the conditions for cooperation is illustrated in two ways. First, the community acts to be sure that justice is done. When rules are violated, people feel the need to punish rule violators, and this motivation does not only involve those personally harmed by wrongdoing. Other members of the community also act to defend group rules, even when not personally involved in a crime. Second, symbolic harm to status and values is punished more severely than material harm. For example, Bachman compared people's reactions to scenarios describing varying types of crime. He found that collective symbolic harm, for example, spitting on the flag, was punished the most severely. Punishment, in other words, is about restoring the status of the group and group rules, in addition to restoring the status of the victim. The literature on organizations is important because it shows that at this organizational or societal level, fairness promotes identification and voluntary cooperation, allowing a more sophisticated form of group functioning to occur. What organizational issue deserves more study? At this time, I think it is important to examine how people decide whether cooperation with existing authorities and institutions is in their own and other people's interests. The same motivations that can promote cooperation can also lead people to create a shared recognition of injustice and to mobilize by creating authorities and institutions whose goals involve producing social change. Our attitude about stability and the maintenance of social order is not constant. Some social models regard societal authorities as benefiting all the members of social groups, though not necessarily equally, and as a result think of legitimacy as a feature of societies that is desirable and beneficial. Other writings, such as those rooted in Marxism, view legitimacy more negatively and welcome instability if it leads to change. But when do people recognize injustice and work for change? Mobilizing for change first requires a recognition that injustice is occurring. Crosby, for example, studied when there's a recognition of injustice among women reading cases about men and women's pay and promotion opportunities in work settings. The initial question is when people label particular experiences or societal conditions as reflecting injustice. The follow-up question is when people then act, and in particular develop shared conceptions of injustice and use them to mobilize groups into action. Just as shared perceptions of justice can enable authorities to gain acceptance of their decisions, shared perceptions of injustice should encourage people to unite and act collectively. Ever since the work of Ash, it has been recognized that the key to translating perception into action is seeing that your understanding of the world is shared. So to me, the key issue is when people develop a collective sense of wrong, something that sustains group effort to mobilize, to redefine models of justice, authority, and social institutions. Studies of collective actions suggest that perceived injustice, especially group-level injustice, encourages collective action. The question is how the victim frames the injustice, as something that is individual or that is linked to groups and group membership. Many acts of injustice are personal, as when a boss shows favoritism to a relative or when a parent abuses a child. And while they lead to anger and retaliation, they do not motivate people to create a shared sense of injustice and to act collectively upon that perceived unfairness. Even when injustice is framed at the group level, it doesn't necessarily follow that people will take action to advance the well-being of a group. In fact, when people see injustice, the occurrence of collective action is relatively rare. Instead, people, including members of disadvantaged groups, frequently acquiesce in the social order, and in so doing, violate their own objectively defined social interests. Efforts to understand when people recognize and act upon perceived injustice have taken on particular importance as the strength and scope of the motivation to justify systems has become clear. In the face of this general tendency to view existing authorities and institutions as desirable, fair, and legitimate, it is especially striking when people are nonetheless able to recognize and move to correct injustice. The recent widespread societal recognition of shared perceptions of macro-level injustice has recently occurred around issues of income inequality, the famous collective movement against the 1% and income inequality. This has led to collective demonstrations. This role of perceived injustice in motivating collective action is reminiscent of early research on justice, beginning with work on relative deprivation, which studied the role of feelings of injustice in shaping collective action such as riots. More recently, justice research has focused more heavily upon the role of justice in motivating individual identification and encouraging higher levels of general cooperation, which is also collective action. With heightened attention to income inequality, the issue of injustice may again be rising to the top of justice concerns. The questions are the same as those raised by the relative deprivation literature. When is inequality viewed as unjust, and how do people respond individually and collectively to the perception of injustice? The active creation of justice as a shared social reality is something that's done by individuals in the context of groups, organizations, institutions, communities, and even larger societies. When they create this shared sense of justice, people facilitate advanced forms of cooperation. So far from being individual in nature, Justice reflects the desire of people to work with others to overcome the short-term self-interested focus into which people might naturally fall as individuals, but which reflects a minimum level of social existence. Instead, people create and use justice to enable themselves to cooperate with higher levels of complexity. These forms of justice encourage the resolution of interpersonal conflicts, support the legitimation of authorities, and facilitate the viability of institutions. Thank you.